They called her a mail-order bride the moment she stepped off the train before she said a single word before anyone asked her name. She stood on that platform with 2 worn suitcases and a letter from a man who wasn't there, and the whole town of Red Hollow watched like she was something to pity. Then a voice cut through the noise. Low. Certain. Ma'am, don't you give them the satisfaction. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train had been running for 11 days. Clara Bennett had counted every one of them, counted them the way a person counts things when they're trying not to think about what comes next. She had counted the water stops, the coal stations, the small towns that flashed past the window like pages turning in someone else's life. She had counted the hours between meals, the times she woke up at 2 in the morning with her heart beating too fast, the number of letters she had read and reread until the paper was soft at the folds. She had $43 left, 2 suitcases, 1 change of dress for the wedding she had planned in her head every night since leaving Ohio. She was 26 years old, and she had already buried her father, sold the family farm, and sent her younger sister to live with cousins she barely knew. She had done all of that without asking anyone for help. She was not accustomed to asking for help. It was the one thing in her life she had always been quietly, stubbornly proud of. The train slowed as it pulled into Red Hollow. Clara pressed her palm flat against the window glass and looked out at the platform. There were maybe 30 people standing there, some waiting for freight, some waiting for family, some just standing there the way people do in small towns when the train comes in because it breaks up the afternoon. She looked for Nathan Cole. She had memorized his description from his letters. Tall, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders. She had told herself she would know him immediately. She scanned every face on that platform twice. He was not there. She told herself he was probably running late. That happened. A man running a cattle ranch in the Montana Territory could be delayed by 100 things, a fence down a calf in trouble mud on the road from the creek. She told herself this, and she believed it right up until the moment she stepped off the train and heard the first woman's voice. There she is. It was not loud. It was barely above a murmur. But Clara had grown up poor enough to know exactly what that tone meant. It meant look at what arrived. It meant we already know what she is. It meant every judgment had already been made before she touched the ground. She stepped down from the train car with both suitcases and stood on the platform and held herself very still. 2 women stood near the depot wall. One was heavy-set, dressed well with a feather in her hat that was slightly too large for the rest of her. The other was younger, thin, with quick eyes that moved over Clara the way you'd look at something you intended to buy and then decided against. The heavy-set woman leaned toward the other one and said not quietly enough, "Another mail-order bride. Lord knows this town has seen enough of those." The younger one made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Look at her dress. She thought she was going to a wedding. Clara felt it land. She would not pretend she didn't. She felt it in the place just below her sternum where she stored things she refused to show. She had worn her best dress. It was pale blue with a white collar, the nicest thing she owned, and she had pressed it herself at the boarding house in Columbus the morning she left. She had thought, I want to look like someone worth meeting. Now she stood on the platform in Red Hollow, Montana, with the whole town watching, and she felt her best dress become a source of mockery in the span of 4 seconds. She did not look at those women. She kept her eyes on the platform and looked for Nathan Cole. A man approached her from the side. He was perhaps 40, sunburned, wearing the weathered look of a ranch hand who had spent too many years outdoors. He held his hat in his hands and turned it around by the brim the way men do when they have bad news they don't know how to start. "Miss Bennett." "Yes." He looked at the ground. "I'm Jim Holt. I work for Mr. Cole." "Where is he?" Jim Holt turned his hat around twice more. "That's the thing, miss. Mr. Cole, he won't be coming." Clara did not say anything right away. She waited. He asked me to come in his place. To tell you that he's—" Jim stopped, exhaled, started again. "He's found another arrangement. He says he's real sorry, but he won't be proceeding with the marriage agreement." Silence. Around her, she could feel the platform's attention shift and tighten. Nobody moved. Nobody pretended they weren't listening. Clara said very carefully, "He found another arrangement." "Yes, ma'am. After I sold my furniture. After I paid my own passage. After 4 months of correspondence in which he told me in writing that he was certain I was the woman he wanted." Jim Holt looked pained. "He is sorry, miss. He said to say that. He is sorry." Clara repeated the words once flat, like she was testing what they weighed. Then she said, "Did he ask you to bring money for the return fare, since I came at his invitation?" Jim blinked. He clearly had not been given any money for a return fare. "No," he said. "I don't believe he know." "Of course not," Clara said quietly. From somewhere behind her right shoulder, that woman with the feathered hat said loudly enough for half the platform to hear, "Poor thing. All that way for nothing. That's what you get." Clara turned around. She turned around slowly, and she looked at the woman with the feathered hat directly and steadily. And she said in a voice that did not shake at all, "I beg your pardon?" The woman blinked. She hadn't expected to be addressed. She raised her chin. "I was only saying it's a shame." "It is a shame," Clara agreed. "It's a shame a man can make a written promise to a woman and break it without consequence. It's a shame a town full of people watching a stranger be humiliated finds it entertaining rather than wrong." She paused. "But I notice you've managed to express your sympathy from a safe distance while doing nothing at all. That must be comfortable for you." The woman with the feathered hat said nothing. The platform had gone very quiet. Clara picked up both her suitcases. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She had cried in private in the dark when she sold her mother's rocking chair to make up the difference on her train ticket. She had cried when she said goodbye to her sister at the station in Columbus. She had used up her tears on things that mattered, and she was not going to use them here in front of strangers who would remember it for years. She looked at Jim Holt. "Is there a boarding house in town?" "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Aldrich runs one on—" "Is it within walking distance?" "About a quarter mile." "Thank you." She started walking. She made it about 8 steps before she heard a new voice. It came from the left near the fence where the horses were tied. It was not raised. It was not performing for an audience. It was simply a voice that cut through everything else the way a cold wind cuts through a doorway. You feel it before you understand what it is. "Hold on." She stopped walking. She was not sure why. Something in the tone made stopping feel more dignified than continuing. She turned. He was standing by the fence, one boot propped on the lower rail, arms folded, watching the platform with an expression that was impossible to read quickly. He was tall, not aggressively so, but enough that he stood distinct from the men around him. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark eyes under the brim of a worn hat and the kind of face that had been weathered by years outdoors without looking diminished by it. His clothes were plain and clean. He looked like a man who was never in a hurry, but who always arrived somewhere before you expected him to. He was looking at this woman with the feathered hat. "You've had your entertainment," he said. Not angry, not threatening, just absolute. "That's done now." The woman opened her mouth. "That's done," he said again the same way, and something in his certainty made her close her mouth again without speaking. He looked at Clara. His gaze was direct but not invasive. It was the way a person looks at someone when they actually want to know what they're seeing. "You need a place to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm managing," Clara said. "I'm not suggesting you aren't." He pushed off the fence and stood straight. "I'm Wyatt Mercer. I run the Mercer Ranch 3 miles north of town. I have a cabin on the property that's been empty since spring. You can stay there while you sort out what comes next." Clara studied him. Why? He seemed to think about the question seriously, rather than brushing it off. "Because you didn't deserve what just happened to you. And because a woman standing alone on a train platform in a strange town with a crowd watching and no good options is a situation that doesn't need to exist when there's a simple solution available. I don't know you." "No, you don't." He met her gaze steadily. You don't have to take the offer. I'm not going to follow you down the street if you say no, but it's a real cabin, not a charity case, and if you want to work for your keep, there's work to be done. That's all." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had learned in 26 years how to read what men were not saying as much as what they were. She had learned the difference between kindness that wanted something and kindness that was simply itself. She had been wrong before. She knew she had been wrong before Nathan Cole's letters had seemed sincere, and she had been wrong about every word of them. But there was something in Wyatt Mercer's face that was not performing anything. He was not trying to look like a good man. He was not posturing for the crowd. He had stopped what was happening on that platform because it offended something in him, not because he wanted anyone to notice. "I'll need to see the cabin before I agree to anything," she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite." "That's fair. And I'll want a clear accounting of what the work arrangement involves." "Also fair." Clara picked up both her suitcases. "All right, Mr. Mercer, show me what you're offering." Behind them, the platform crowd slowly dispersed, taking their whispers with them. Jim Holt stood for another moment with his hat in his hands, then turned and walked away. And Clara did not watch him go. She followed Wyatt Mercer to where his horse and wagon were tied, and she climbed up without waiting for help, and she sat straight, and she did not look back at the platform. She had $43 and 2 suitcases and no plan. That was not, she told herself, the worst position she had ever been in. She had started from worse. The Mercer Ranch was not what Clara expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, something rough, perhaps consistent with the image of a solitary man who lived 3 miles from town and apparently had a reputation for keeping to himself. She had expected something functional, practical, stripped of comfort, the way men stripped their surroundings when there was no one to consider but themselves. What she found was a property that was clearly cared for, not in a showy way, but in the way of someone who paid attention. The fence rails were straight. The outbuildings were tight and dry. The main house was a solid, decent-sized structure with a front porch, and though it lacked the kind of decoration a woman might have added, it did not lack for maintenance. The cabin Wyatt showed her sat about 40 yards behind the main house near a stand of cottonwoods. It was one room with a decent stove, a bed, a table, and a window that faced east. There was a latch on the inside of the door. Clara tested it immediately, not secretly, and Wyatt stood by the door and watched her test it without comment. "Water from the pump out back," he said. "Firewood stacked on the east wall. I'll have one of the hands bring extra before nightfall." "This is a real offer," Clara said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't make offers I don't mean." She set her suitcases down and looked around the room. "What is it you need done exactly, on the ranch?" "The household accounts are a mess. My last foreman kept his own records, and they don't match what I see in the ledgers. I need someone who can go through them and find where things have gone wrong. After that, if you're willing, there's managing the supply orders correspondence with the buyers in Billings' kitchen oversight." He paused. "My cook left in August, and I've been managing with whatever the hands can throw together. It hasn't been going well. You need a bookkeeper and a housekeeper." "I need both, yes." "What do you pay?" He told her. It was a fair wage, not generous to the point of being suspicious, but honest. Clara did the arithmetic in her head and figured that if she lived carefully, she could save enough in 3 months to give herself real choices. That was all she needed, real choices. Everything else came from there. "All right," she said. "I'll start with the accounts." "Tomorrow's soon enough." "Today's better," Clara said. "I'd rather be useful than sit here thinking." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recognition of something he hadn't anticipated. "The ledgers are in the office," he said. "I'll show you." Jid. The accounts were a disaster. Not in a way that suggested anyone had been deliberately dishonest. It was more the chaos of a man who understood cattle and land and weather, but had never developed any natural gift for numbers. Things were recorded in 3 different hands, across 4 different books, with no clear system connecting them. Supply costs had been tracked separately from labor costs, which had been tracked separately from sale revenues, with no running total that meant anything. Clara sat at the desk in the small office off the main room and went through it all with the focused patience she had learned as a girl keeping her father's records while he worked. She had been doing accounts since she was 14. She knew the particular grammar of a ledger the way money told stories if you knew how to read them. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. When she finally sat back, Wyatt appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He set one at the edge of the desk without being asked, and Clara thought small thing, but registered the fact that he had thought about it and done it without ceremony. "How bad?" he asked. "Not criminal," she said. "Disorganized. Your former foreman was buying supplies at prices about 15% above what you should have been paying. Either he was getting a kickback from the supplier, or he simply wasn't negotiating. You've also been undercharging the billings buyers. Your per-head price is lower than the territory average by nearly $8. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "How do you know what the territory average is?" "I don't. I'm inferring from what I can calculate based on the cattle counts and the revenue figures, but I'd like to get the billings market reports if you can get them. That would let me be precise." He looked at her with that same expression from the platform, the one that was simply paying attention. "You've done this before." "My father's farm, then a dry goods merchant in Columbus for 2 years before he closed the business." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm good at this. It's not a modest claim. It's just true." "I can see that." Clara glanced up. He said it without flattery, without the particular tone men use when they're impressed by a woman doing something they consider surprising. He said it the way you'd say, "The stove is hot," or "The fence is straight." A simple observed fact. She looked back at the ledger. "I'll have a clear picture for you by end of the week. Then we can talk about what to do about the supply contracts." "All right." He left her to it. The first week at the Mercer Ranch passed in work, and work was the only thing Clara wanted from it. She reorganized the accounts. She renegotiated through written correspondence the supply arrangement with the hardware merchant in town. She wrote the letter herself, and Wyatt signed it without changing a word, which she noted. She established a proper running ledger. She took over the kitchen from the rotating custody of 3 ranch hands who had been producing food that was by her assessment technically edible, but dispiriting. She cooked. She had always cooked. In her family home, it had been necessity. At the Mercer Ranch, it became something else. One of the ranch hands, a weathered man named Charlie Foss, who had worked the property for 6 years, told her on the 4th day that it was the first proper meal he'd had since the previous cook left, and he said it with such simple feeling that Clara had to turn back to the stove to keep her face private. She was aware that the town was talking about her. She heard it in pieces from the merchant who delivered the week's supplies, and couldn't quite hide his curiosity from a woman named Mrs. Hale, who came to the ranch on a matter of church business, and spent the entire visit trying to determine exactly what Clara's arrangement with Wyatt was. Clara answered Mrs. Hale's questions with complete, precise honesty, which seemed to disappoint her. Wyatt did not appear to care what the town said. This Clara came to understand was not indifference. He was aware of it, and it cost him something, she could tell that. But he had decided at some point in his life that other people's opinions were not a currency he was willing to trade in. And he had held to that decision through what appeared to be considerable social pressure. She respected that, more than she would have expected. On the 8th day, Nathan Cole rode up to the property. Clara was at the pump filling a water bucket when she heard the horse and turned to see him riding down the approach path. She recognized him immediately from the daguerreotype he had sent with his first letter, though he was smaller in person than she'd imagined from his description of himself. He dismounted and walked toward her with an expression that tried for apologetic and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of expecting forgiveness before he'd asked for it. "Clara," he said. "Miss Bennett." She kept filling the bucket. "I owed you an apology in person," he said. "What happened at the station, I should have come myself." "You should have done several things differently," Clara agreed pleasantly. "But you didn't, so here we are." He looked around the ranch with a proprietary expression that puzzled her until she understood what it meant. He thought she was here because she had no other option, that staying at the Mercer Ranch was the act of a desperate woman with nowhere else to land. "I can explain about the change in plans," he said. "There's a woman I've known in the territory for some years. She and I had an understanding once before I placed the advertisement, and when she indicated her feelings had—" "Mr. Cole," Clara said. He stopped. "I don't need an explanation. I needed one 2 weeks ago before I spent my savings on a train ticket. I don't need one now. I just thought if you'd like to discuss the possibility of—" "I wouldn't." She set the bucket down and looked at him directly. "You rejected someone you had made a commitment to, without warning, without compensation, and without the basic courtesy of telling her yourself. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are. There is no arrangement between us that I would enter into now." Nathan Cole's face reddened. He was not used to being spoken to this way, by a woman he had apparently filed in his mind as someone grateful for his attention. He straightened and said with some stiffness, "I see you've found a comfortable enough situation here." "I've found work," Clara said. "That was all I ever needed." He left. Clara carried her water bucket inside, and her hands were steady, and she was quietly, fiercely glad. Wyatt had seen the exchange from the porch. He hadn't intervened. He'd watched, and when Nathan Cole rode away, and Clara came inside with the water bucket, Wyatt was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the revised supply list she'd prepared, and he said nothing about what he'd seen. That evening, after the hands had eaten, and the ranch had gone quiet, Clara came out to the porch where Wyatt often sat in the late hour, and she said, "That was Nathan Cole." "I know who it was," Wyatt said. "I didn't need you to handle it." "I know you didn't." He looked out at the dark. "I wasn't going to." Clara sat down in the other chair. This was not something she had consciously decided, her body simply did. It found the chair and settled into it with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years rather than 8 days. "He thought I was here because I was desperate," she said. "Most people think that." "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think you'd have found a way regardless. The situation here just happened to offer itself first." Clara looked at him. "That's an unusually honest answer." "Dishonest answers take more effort, and they don't hold up as well." She almost laughed. Something about the flat, practical delivery of it. There was no performance in the man. None at all. He said what he meant, and meant what he said, and seemed to find the alternative simply inefficient. "Why do people in town say you're cold?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question. "Because I don't talk much at socials. Because I didn't court any of the women who expected to be courted. Because I turned down a business partnership with Richard Voss 3 years ago, and he's been making sure people remember it unfavorably." "Richard Voss," Clara repeated. She had heard the name. Charlie Foss had mentioned him briefly with a careful neutrality that meant something. "He owns the largest cattle operation in the county," Wyatt said. "He's been buying up smaller ranches for 2 years. The ones that can't survive a hard winter, he offers when they're most desperate." "What does he want with your ranch?" "He doesn't specifically want this ranch. He wants the creek access. 3 miles of creek that crosses this property are the water rights for half the eastern range. Without them, the grazing value of the land he already owns drops significantly." Clara was quiet, thinking. "So if something were to happen to this operation financially or by reputation, you'd be more likely to sell." Wyatt looked at her. "That's a very quick grasp of a situation. It's a simple economic logic. And you mentioned he's been spreading rumors." She paused. "He's not done, is he?" "No," Wyatt said. "He's not done." The evening air had gone cold the way Montana evenings did, quickly, completely, without apology. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and said, "Then we'd better make sure the books are in perfect order. If he comes at you financially or legally, you want everything documented and clean." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "I hired you for the accounts," he said. "You hired me for the accounts," she agreed. "The accounts include protecting the financial standing of the operation. That's the same thing." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, one that seemed to involve both assessment and something more complicated, something she was not ready to name. "All right," he said. They sat on the porch in the dark for a while longer, not speaking, but not in the way of two strangers with nothing to say. In the way Clara thought of two people who have found that the other one's company doesn't require filling with noise. That was rarer than she would have guessed. She had come to Red Hollow, Montana carrying 2 suitcases and a letter from a man who didn't show up. She had not come looking for this, but she was starting to think that this, whatever this was, might be worth staying for. Not because she had nowhere else to go. That, she thought, was the whole difference. The thing about small towns is that they don't need facts to build a story. They just need a starting point, and Red Hollow had been given a very good one. Within 10 days of Clara's arrival at the Mercer Ranch, the version of events circulating through town had already grown 3 separate editions that bore no resemblance to anything that had actually happened. According to Mrs. Hale, who had appointed herself the unofficial record keeper of other people's business, Clara had shown up at the ranch uninvited, and Wyatt had been too polite to turn her away. According to the man who ran the feed store, she was a woman of questionable character, who had been asked to leave her previous situation in Ohio under circumstances nobody could quite specify. According to the 2 women from the platform, the one with the feathered hat was named Doris Crane, and her companion was a younger woman named Lila Pratt. Clara had clearly set her sights on Wyatt Mercer's property the moment Nathan Cole failed to show up, because that was what women like her did. Clara knew all of this because Charlie Foss told her. He told her without editorializing in the same flat factual voice he used to report that a fence post was loose or the north pasture needed checking, and she appreciated it. She would rather know what was being said than have it circling somewhere she couldn't see it. "Does any of it bother you?" Charlie asked. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee while Clara worked through the morning supply list. "It would bother me if it were true," she said. "Since it isn't, it's mostly just inconvenient." Charlie nodded slowly. "Wyatt doesn't let it touch him." "I've noticed." "He's had practice," Charlie said, and left it there. She didn't push. She had learned already that Charlie Foss said exactly what he meant to say, and no more, and that the spaces around his words often held more than the words themselves. What she had gathered in pieces from Charlie and from the ordinary daily texture of the ranch was that Wyatt Mercer had not always been the closed-off solitary man the town described. Something had happened some years back, something involving a woman, or a business arrangement gone wrong, or both, or something else entirely that nobody would quite name directly. Whatever it was had stripped something from him and left behind what she saw now, a man who was capable of great decency, but had decided that decency was best practiced at a distance. She thought about that while she worked. Then she stopped thinking about it and focused on the supply list, because there was a discrepancy in the flour account that was bothering her. The morning the letter arrived from Richard Voss was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Clara had come to the ranch. Wyatt brought it to the office where she was working and set it on the desk in front of her without a word. She looked up, read his expression carefully neutral, which on Wyatt meant something was wrong, and picked up the letter. It was written in the smooth, confident hand of a man who had dictated it to a secretary. It was polite in the way that legal threats are polite, which is to say it was perfectly courteous and completely aggressive. Voss expressed his long-standing admiration for the Mercer property and his awareness that operating a ranch of this scope presented certain challenges, particularly heading into the winter months. He noted that he had recently become aware of certain irregularities in the Mercer Ranch's supply accounts. He did not specify how he had become aware of this, and expressed his concern that the operation might be facing financial difficulties. He offered to buy the creek access parcel for a fair price which he named, and which was roughly 40% of what Clara estimated it was actually worth. He signed it with warm regards. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down. "He has someone in the supply chain," she said. "Someone who told him about the account irregularities before I fixed them. He was watching." Wyatt sat down across from her. "I suspected. Who knew about the account problems besides you and me? The hands know in a general way that the books were a mess. Jim Aldrich at the hardware store would have known something was off from the order patterns. Jim Aldrich, Clara said. Is he close with Voss? Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. His wife's brother works for Voss. There it is. Clara leaned back. He's been building a picture of this ranch as financially unstable. If he can establish that clearly enough through the right conversations, the right rumors, he creates pressure. Lenders get nervous, buyers get skittish. You become the easiest solution to your own problem. He's been doing this to 3 other ranches in the last 2 years. Did they sell? 2 of them. Clara looked at the letter again. Then he knows it works. She picked up her pen. I'm going to write back. Wyatt looked at her. I was going to... What were you going to say? He paused. I was going to tell him no. You can absolutely tell him no, Clara said. But before you do, let me write a response that makes clear this operation is not what he thinks it is. You sign it. We lay out the corrected accounts, the new supply arrangements, the projected revenue for spring. Make him understand that whoever gave him his information is working with outdated material. She met Wyatt's eyes. Don't just shut the door. Show him what's behind it. Wyatt studied her for a long moment. You've dealt with men like this before. In Columbus, the merchant I worked for had a competitor who tried to undercut him the same way. Reputation damage, financial pressure, a lowball offer at the right moment. She paused. He succeeded, actually. Because my employer waited too long to push back, and by the time he did, the story was already set. What would you have done differently? Exactly what I'm suggesting now. She was already writing. Don't defend. Present. There's a difference. Defense suggests you have something to hide. Presentation says, look at what we've built. Those are 2 very different conversations. Wyatt watched her write for a moment. All right, he said. She wrote the letter in an hour. It was 3 pages clear and precise, and it outlined the Mercer Ranch's current financial position, the corrections made to the accounts, the renegotiated supply contracts, and the projected spring cattle revenues with supporting calculations. It was not threatening. It was not defensive. It was simply a document that made Richard Voss's offer look not just inadequate, but slightly absurd, as if he had tried to purchase something valuable while dramatically underestimating what it was worth. Wyatt read it when she finished. He read it slowly, all 3 pages, and then he read the last page again. This is exactly right, he said. I know, Clara said, and meant it without arrogance. He looked up from the pages, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not exactly surprise, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been expecting less than what he received and doesn't quite know where to put the difference. He signed it. She sent it with the afternoon post. That should have been the end of the morning's drama. It wasn't. Charlie Foss came in from the north pasture at noon with a look on his face that Clara had not seen on him before, and Charlie Foss was not a man whose face changed easily. There's a woman at the gate, he said. Says she needs to speak to Wyatt. Who is she? Charlie took his time answering, which told Clara something. Her name's Margaret Hollis. She and Wyatt. He stopped. She was here before, some years back. Clara kept her expression neutral. I'll get him. She found Wyatt in his barn and told him simply that there was a woman named Margaret Hollis at the gate asking for him. She watched his face when she said the name, and she saw something move through it. Not guilt, not quite, but something old and complicated that had clearly never been fully resolved. I'll go, he said. Of course, Clara said. She went back to the office, and she did not watch from the window, because that was not who she was. She worked on the spring revenue projections, and she was very deliberate and focused, and she thought about numbers, and only numbers, and absolutely nothing else. 40 minutes later, Wyatt came in. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the same chair he always used, and he looked at his hands for a moment. She's a widow, he said. Her husband died last spring. She and I, before I built this ranch, there was an understanding between us. Her family didn't approve of what I was at the time. I had nothing. She chose a man with property and a good name in town. He paused. She's changed her mind about what matters. Clara kept her voice even. What did you tell her? That I wished her well. She looked up from the ledger. He was looking at her directly. There was something deliberate in the look, something that wanted her to understand something, though he hadn't quite said what it was. That was all, she asked. That was all. He stood up. I wanted you to know about it, before you heard some version of it from someone else. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and left, and Clara sat for a moment with her pen in her hand and thought about the particular weight of a man telling you something he didn't have to tell you, the way that act of honesty was itself a kind of statement, even when no direct statement had been made. Then she went back to the projections, because the numbers didn't wait and the work didn't wait, and she had learned a long time ago that the best way to keep her footing was to keep moving. Margaret Hollis, as it turned out, did not leave quietly. Clara heard about it from two separate sources within 48 hours, from Charlie Foss, who reported it as neutral fact, and from Mrs. Hale, who arrived at the ranch the following Thursday, ostensibly to deliver a message about the church social, but actually to determine what Clara thought about the development. Clara gave her 3 minutes of polite vagueness and then excused herself to check on the stove. What Margaret Hollis had apparently done was go directly to Doris Crane after leaving the Mercer Ranch, and what she had told Doris Crane was that the presence of a strange woman living on the ranch was preventing Wyatt from making the decisions he would otherwise naturally make, and that someone ought to speak to him about propriety before the situation became a scandal. Doris Crane had found this very interesting. By the following Monday, the story in town was that Clara Bennett had positioned herself deliberately to block Wyatt Mercer from resuming a relationship with a respectable widow, which was exactly the kind of scheming that women of her sort were known for. Clara found this irritating not because it hurt her feelings, but because it was strategically timed, and she suspected the timing was not accidental. Margaret Hollis coming to the ranch, the subsequent rumor cascaded the pressure on Wyatt's reputation, all of it in the same window as Voss's letter. She didn't know if that was coordination or coincidence. She asked Wyatt directly one evening, "Do you think Voss is connected to what Margaret Hollis is doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think Voss knows which levers are available, and he's not particular about which ones he uses. Margaret Hollis is a lever. She needs money," Wyatt said. "Her husband's estate is in debt. If she married again someone with a stable ranch, it solves a problem." He paused. "If I am instead seen as a man with a compromised reputation, who made a poor decision by letting a disreputable woman live on his property, that's also useful to Voss. Either way, pressure on this ranch is good for him." Clara took that in. "He's good at this. He's been doing it for a long time. So are we keeping his ledger or his schedule?" she asked. Wyatt looked at her. "Meaning?" Clara said, "Every week we spend managing what he's doing instead of building what we have. We're working for him. I'd rather work for us." Something shifted in his face. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop waiting for his next move and make one of our own." She leaned forward slightly. "The Billings buyers, when do they come through next?" "Late November. They make their rounds before winter. I want to meet with them before they get here. I want to get in front of them with the new numbers, the revised projections, the contract terms I've been working on. If we can lock in better rates before winter, we have a cash position heading into spring that makes any story Voss tells look ridiculous on its face." Wyatt looked at her for a long time. "That would require you going to Billings," he said. "Yes. A woman traveling alone to Billings to represent a ranch in business negotiations." "I'm aware of how that sounds to people in this town," Clara said. "I'm also aware that I am better at this than anyone else currently available, and that the outcome is worth more than anyone's comfort with the optics." She met his eyes, "Including mine." He was quiet. "Wyatt," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it first, and she noticed, and she thought he noticed too. "Do you trust my judgment on this?" The question sat between them. "Yes," he said. It was simple, unhesitating. the way he said everything. "Then let me go to Billings." He agreed. She left on a Wednesday morning alone with a leather satchel containing the ranch accounts, the revised projections, and 3 letters of introduction that Wyatt had written, and which she had then quietly improved before he signed them, moving certain sentences to positions of greater emphasis without changing their substance. The Billings buyers were 3 men who had been purchasing Montana cattle for a syndicate of Eastern investors for 5 years. Their names were Harrison Boyle and a man named Eckerd who did most of the talking. They met her in a hotel sitting room and looked at her with the particular careful neutrality men use when they're surprised but don't want to show it. Clara put the accounts on the table. She went through them methodically without preamble, and she spoke with the precision she used when the numbers were sound, and the confidence she had developed doing this for 15 years in various forms. She did not soften the projections or apologize for them. She presented the Mercer Ranch as what it was: a well-managed, financially stable operation with exceptional creek access, improving year-over-year numbers and terms that were worth their consideration. Eckerd asked 3 hard questions. She answered all 3 before he finished asking the second one. Boyle leaned back in his chair after the first 20 minutes and said quietly to Harrison, "Where'd Cole find her?" "She's not with Cole," Harrison said, also quietly watching her. "Who's she with?" "Mercer." There was a pause. "Huh," Boyle said. By the end of the meeting, she had a handshake agreement on a per-head rate $11 higher than what the ranch had received the previous year, with a preferred supplier clause that locked in the relationship for 2 seasons. She sent a telegram to the ranch that afternoon. It said, "Rate secured. Preferred supplier agreed. Home Friday." Wyatt was waiting at the station when the Friday train came in. He wasn't standing back this time. He was at the platform edge, and when she stepped off the train, he was already there, and something in the way he was standing told her he had been standing there for a while. She had the leather satchel over her shoulder. She handed him the folder with the signed agreement documents and watched him look at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. $11, he said. 11. He looked up. "Clara." She waited. He seemed to be doing something difficult, gathering something that he had kept carefully stored for a long time, and was trying to work out how to move without dropping it. "I have been running this ranch alone for 6 years, he said. "I have had good hands, good stock, reasonable luck most years. And in 3 weeks you have done more for this operation than I managed in—" He stopped, started again. "I don't say that to diminish what I built. I say it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it said plainly." Clara looked at him on that platform in Billings, with the autumn light coming down at an angle and the noise of the station all around them, and she felt something that she identified with great care and deliberateness, because she had been wrong about feelings before, and she was not in the habit of letting herself get ahead of the evidence. What she felt was not gratitude, though she was grateful. It was not relief, though she felt that too. It was something more like recognition, the particular feeling of being seen accurately by another person, which is rarer than almost anything else in the world. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "That's why it matters." They rode back to Red Hollow on the same train sitting across from each other, and somewhere past the second water stop, Wyatt fell asleep, which Clara took as a particular mark of trust, because he did not seem like a man who fell asleep easily in the presence of other people. She looked out the window at Montana rolling past in the late afternoon and thought about what came next. She had $43 when she arrived. She had saved nearly double that now. She had the offer from the Billings buyers. She had the clean accounts and the solid projections and a 2-season contract that changed what the ranch's winter looked like fundamentally. She realized, built something here, in 3 weeks, out of numbers and stubbornness and the complete refusal to be what people had decided she was before they knew her name. The question, the one she was not quite ready to ask herself directly, was whether what she had built was only about the ranch. She was still working on that question when the train pulled into Red Hollow. What she found when they arrived was not the quiet she had expected. Charlie Foss was waiting at the station, and Charlie Foss waiting at the station at 6 in the evening meant something had happened. "What is it?" Wyatt said before Charlie had said a word. Charlie said it plainly, the way he always said things. "Voss's man came by the ranch this afternoon. Said there's a county land commission meeting being called for next month. He's filing a challenge to the creek access deeds." Silence. "He's challenging the water rights," Clara said. "Says there's a question about the original survey, from 1871. Charlie looked at Wyatt. "He's saying the deed was improperly recorded, and the creek access never legally transferred to your family." Wyatt's face had gone very still. Clara understood what that stillness meant. The creek access was not just a business asset. It was what Wyatt's father had built on. It was what the ranch stood on literally, and in every way that mattered. "He can't do that," she said, and then immediately, because she was an honest woman, "Can he do that?" "If the original survey is flawed," Wyatt said carefully, "and if a commission decides the transfer was defective, yes, he can." "Who sits on the county land commission?" Charlie and Wyatt exchanged a look. "3 men, Wyatt said. "Aldrich, Porter," he paused, "and Voss himself sits as the at-large member." Clara took a breath. "Of course he does," she said. She picked up her satchel. "All right," she said. "I need to see the original deed, tonight." Wyatt looked at her. "Clara, tonight, Wyatt," she said. "We have 4 weeks. The Billings agreement buys us time, but not if we lose the water rights. Show me the deed." He showed her the deed. It was a single document worn at the folds dated March 1871, and Clara sat at the office desk with a lamp pulled close and read it with the same focused patience she brought to everything, and the more she read it, the more she understood exactly what Richard Voss had found. The survey numbers in the deed were internally consistent, but there was a notation in the margin, small in a different hand, obviously added later, that referenced a corrected survey from 1873. And the 1873 survey was not attached to the deed. Without that corrected survey, there was technically a gap in the documented transfer. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't fabricated. It was a paperwork gap that had existed for 11 years without mattering because nobody had ever looked for it, until Richard Voss looked for it. Clara sat back from the lamp and thought. "Is the 1873 survey lost?" she asked. "I don't know that it exists," Wyatt said. He was standing near the door watching her. "It has to exist," she said. "The marginal note references it by date and by the surveyor's name. A man named," she leaned forward, "Caleb Marsh." She looked up. "Is Caleb Marsh still alive?" Wyatt stared at her. "Is he?" she pressed. "He retired," Wyatt said slowly. "He lives in Helena." Clara closed the deed and held it for a moment. "Then that's where we need to go," she said. "Because if Caleb Marsh still has his survey records and surveyors keep their records, Wyatt, they have to for exactly this reason, then we have a document that closes the gap and makes Voss's challenge worthless." Wyatt was very quiet. "You've been here 3 weeks, he said. "I know how long I've been here. You're talking about going to Helena, for a ranch that isn't yours." Clara looked at him steadily across the lamplight. "It isn't mine because nobody's offered it to me," she said. And then she stopped, because that had come out more plainly than she intended, and she felt heat rise in her face that she hoped the lamp's shadow covered. The room was very quiet. Wyatt looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Go to Helena with me," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was the same straightforward, unhurried voice he used for everything. But it wasn't a practical request either. There was something underneath it that was clearly not about the survey. Clara held his gaze for 3 seconds. "For the survey records," she said. "Yes," he said. "For the survey records." A beat. "All right," she said. She picked up the deed and started making notes, and the lamp threw their shadows against the wall, and outside the Montana night had gone fully cold, and neither of them said anything more about what had just been said without being said. But they both knew something had shifted. And this time, Clara did not try to talk herself out of knowing it. They left before sunrise. Wyatt had the wagon ready at 4 in the morning, and Clara was already at the gate when he brought it around her satchel over one shoulder, and the original deed wrapped carefully in oilcloth tucked under her arm. She had slept 3 hours, maybe 4. She didn't feel tired. She felt the way she always felt when there was a clear problem and a possible solution, and a road between them, alert-focused and oddly calm in the way that battle readiness sometimes looks like calm from the outside. Charlie Foss stood in the yard watching them go. He didn't say anything. He lifted one hand as they pulled out, and Wyatt lifted his chin in return, and that was the entire goodbye. They were 2 hours out of Red Hollow before either of them spoke about anything beyond the immediate practical road conditions, the weather coming down from the north, how long the Helena trip would take if they made good time. The conversation was easy, in the way that conversations are easy between people who have gotten past the stage of performing ease and arrived at the actual thing. Then Wyatt said, without particular preamble, "My father built this ranch on that creek access." Clara waited. He came to Montana in 1868 with $40 and a mule and a stubborn conviction that the Eastern Range was going to be cattle country inside of 10 years. Everyone told him he was wrong. He bought the parcel nobody wanted because it ran along the creek, and people thought he was foolish because the soil was rocky and the winters were hard and there was nothing out there yet. He paused. He was right about the cattle country. He was right about everything except living long enough to see it. When did he die? 1877. I was 29. The ranch was 3 years old and barely standing. Another pause. I spent 6 years after that just keeping it alive. Not building, just surviving. Clara held the oilcloth-wrapped deed in her lap and listened. If Voss takes that creek access, Wyatt said, it's not just the water rights. He wins the argument my father started in 1868. He proves that it was all foolishness, that it never should have been ours. He stopped. I know that sounds like sentiment. It doesn't, Clara said. It's not good legal reasoning. No, she agreed. But it's true, and true things don't have to be legal to matter. She looked at him. We're going to Helena to get the survey. That's the legal reasoning. But I understand why we're really going. He glanced at her sideways and said nothing, and she thought that might be the most direct acknowledgement she would get from him, and that it was enough. The road to Helena was long, and the wagon was not built for comfort. And by mid-morning, Clara's back was aching from the jolts and her hands were cold even through her gloves. She didn't say anything about either. She reviewed her notes instead, going over the deed language again, mapping out exactly what she needed from Caleb Marsh, thinking through what the commission hearing would require. She was in the middle of calculating how much time they had between the Helena visit and the filing deadline, when Wyatt said abruptly, "Margaret Hollis came back." Clara's pen stopped moving on the paper. "When?" she asked. "Yesterday afternoon, while Charlie was at the station waiting for us." He kept his eyes on the road. "She came to the house. What did she want?" "She said she wanted to make sure I understood the situation clearly." That's how she put it. She said that a woman in her position, a widow, established in the community, a woman with connections and reputation, could be a considerable asset to a man running a ranch that was facing difficulties. Clara heard what was underneath that. She was offering herself as a solution. That's what she was doing. And you said, "I said that I appreciated her concern and that the ranch's difficulties were well in hand." He paused. "She said that she'd heard I was letting a mail-order bride manage my finances, and that people were starting to talk about my judgment." The word landed the way it always landed, not like a blow, more like something dropped on a bruise that was already there. Clara kept her voice level. "And what did you say to that?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I said that the woman managing my finances had just secured a 2-season preferred supplier agreement in Billings at $11 above our previous rate, and that, if that's what a mail-order bride's judgment looked like, I'd take it over most men's judgment I'd encountered." He paused again. "Then I asked her to leave." Clara looked down at the paper in her lap. She was doing something she had trained herself not to do, which was feel too much too quickly about something she hadn't fully examined yet. She was aware of the feeling, the particular warmth of being defended by someone who didn't have to defend you, who chose to do it, not because they were obligated, but because something in them required it. She was also aware that she was on a wagon 2 hours from Red Hollow, going to Helena, to save a ranch that wasn't hers, and that the man she was going with had just told a woman with property and connections and a respectable reputation that Clara Bennett's judgment was worth more than most men's, and that the combination of those two facts was something she needed to think about carefully rather than just feel. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't telling you to thank you," he said. "I was telling you because you needed to know what she said about you and what I said back." "I know." She picked her pen back up. "I'm thanking you anyway." He made a sound that was almost but not quite a grunt, which she had come to understand was Wyatt's version of, "You're welcome," and she went back to her notes, and the wagon rolled on toward Helena. And neither of them mentioned Margaret Hollis again. Caleb Marsh lived in a small house on the east side of Helena, and he was 73 years old, and had the look of a man who had spent decades outdoors, and then come inside and taken very good care of himself since. He had a sharp face and sharper eyes, and when he opened the door and found them on his porch, he looked at Clara first, not dismissively, but with the particular assessment of a man who has learned to read people quickly because his work required it. "Mr. Marsh," Clara said, "my name is Clara Bennett. I work for Wyatt Mercer of the Mercer Ranch in Red Hollow. This is Mr. Mercer. We believe you surveyed land adjoining the Sweetgrass Creek in 1873, and we need to know if you still have those records." Caleb Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Thomas Mercer's boy," he said. Wyatt nodded. Something moved across the old man's face. Recognition memory. Something softer. "Your father was a fair man. One of the few in that county who paid what he owed without argument." He opened the door wider. "Come in. Tell me what's happening." They told him. Clara did most of the talking, laying out the deed, the marginal notation, the commission, challenge, the timeline. Marsh listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat for a long time with his hands folded. "I have all my records," he said. "Every survey I did from 1866 to 1891. They're in boxes in the back room." He looked at Clara. "You said the notation references March 1873. "Yes. The corrected survey of the creek access parcel cross-referenced to the original 1871 deed." Marsh stood up. "Give me 20 minutes." He was back in 14. He came back carrying the flat leather case worn at the corners, and he opened it on the table between them with the careful, practiced hands of a man who knew exactly what he had. He pulled out a folded document and spread it on the table. "Sweetgrass Creek East Parcel Corrected Survey, March 14, 1873, he said. "I did this survey myself. The original 1871 deed had an error in the eastern boundary notation. Common problem with the federal surveys from that period, they were rushing everything. Your father hired me to do a corrected survey and filed a notification with the Territorial Land Office." "Do you have a record of the filing?" Clara asked. "I have a copy of the filing receipt." He went back into the leather case and produced a second document, smaller official, with the Territorial Land Office stamp. "Your father kept the original. This is my copy, but it references the same document by date and filing number." Clara picked up the filing receipt and read it twice very carefully. Her heart was doing something she was trying to keep off her face. "This is enough," she said. "This closes the gap in the deed transfer. The commission challenge has no basis." Marsh looked at her. "Who filed the challenge?" "Richard Voss." The old man was quiet for a moment. "Voss." He said the name the way you'd say a word in a language you didn't like. "I know who he is. I surveyed land for 2 ranchers he put out of business. Good men, both of them. Didn't know what hit them until it was too late." "We know what hit us," Clara said. "That's the difference." Marsh looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You're not from Montana," he said. "Ohio." "What are you doing out here?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "Building something," she said. He nodded slowly. "Your father would approve." he said to Wyatt. "Of the work she's doing, and of the fact that you had the sense to let her do it." Wyatt said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, and Clara did not look at him because she was keeping her composure, and looking at him right now would make that harder. Marsh gave them the corrected survey and the filing receipt copy. He signed a notarized statement attesting to their authenticity. He refused payment for his time, and when Clara pressed him, he said that Thomas Mercer had been the kind of man whose son deserved help when he needed it, and that was the end of the conversation. They left Helena 2 hours later. The ride back to Red Hollow was different from the ride out. The documents were in Clara's satchel, now wrapped in fresh oilcloth, and the weight of them was different from what she'd been carrying before. Before it had been the weight of a problem, and now it was the weight of a solution, and those felt entirely different in the hand. They were an hour out of Helena when the weather changed. It came from the north. The way Montana weather came fast without announcement, as if the sky had simply decided it was time and didn't feel it needed to inform anyone. The temperature dropped in the span of 20 minutes, the wind picked up, and the first snow began coming down sideways. Wyatt pulled the wagon off the road and under what shelter was available, and unhitched the horse, and covered it, and he moved with the quick, efficient certainty of a man who had been dealing with Montana winters for a long time. He handed Clara an extra blanket from the wagon bed without ceremony, and she took it without ceremony, and they sat together in the relative shelter of the wagon, with the snow coming down around them. "This will pass in an hour," he said. "You're sure? I know this kind of storm. It's early season, fast moving. It'll blow through." Clara pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat with her satchel in her lap. The wind was loud and the cold was real, but she had been cold before, and she had learned that cold was manageable if you didn't panic about it. After a few minutes, Wyatt said, "What are you thinking about?" She was thinking about several things simultaneously, which was her usual condition, but she chose the one that was most immediately relevant. "I'm thinking about who told Voss about the deed gap." He was quiet. "He knew about it specifically enough to file a formal challenge," she said. "That means he saw the actual deed, or someone who saw the actual deed told him about the marginal notation. Who has access to those records besides you?" "The deed is kept in the ranch office," Wyatt said. "The hands know where it is in case of emergency." "Could any of them?" "No," he said, flat, certain. "You trust all of them that completely. Charlie's been with me since the beginning. Hank Morse has 3 kids and needs this job. Pete Aldrich is—" He stopped. Clara looked at him. "Pete Aldrich," she said. "As in Jim Aldrich from the hardware store. His nephew," Wyatt said. He said it quietly, and there was something in his voice that was not anger exactly, but was heavier than surprise and heavier than disappointment. The particular weight of a betrayal from someone you had treated fairly. "When did Pete start working at the ranch?" 6 months ago. "And you said Jim Aldrich's wife's brother works for Voss." The silence between them held that thought. "I trusted him," Wyatt said, not with self-pity, with the flat acknowledgement of a man counting the cost of something. "You trusted him because you had no reason not to," Clara said. "Voss put him in your operation specifically so you would have no reason not to. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's a deliberately constructed situation." She paused. "Does Pete know we went to Helena?" Wyatt thought about it. "He was in the barn when I was hitching the wagon." "Then Voss knows we're looking for the survey." They looked at each other. "How long until we get back?" Clara asked. "With the weather 4 hours, maybe 5. "Then Voss has 4 hours to do something with that information." She was already thinking ahead. What could he do? If he knows the survey exists and that we're getting it? Wyatt's jaw tightened. He could try to discredit Marsh. He could file for an emergency commission hearing before we get back with the documentation. He could... He stopped. Or he could go directly to the ranch. Clara looked at him sharply. "Why the ranch?" "Because the deed itself is there, the original. If the survey and the filing receipt are in your hands, but the deed they reference is suddenly unavailable." "Charlie," Clara said. Wyatt was already on his feet. He got the horse rehitched in 5 minutes despite the snow and wind, and they were back on the road before Clara had fully processed what they were doing, and she held onto the satchel and the wagon rail and did not tell him to be careful with the road conditions, because he knew the road conditions better than she did, and speed was currently more important than comfort. They were 2 hours out of Red Hollow when they met Charlie on the road. He was riding toward them at a pace that said everything before he opened his mouth. Wyatt pulled the wagon up. What happened? Charlie pulled alongside. His face was set in the particular way of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. Voss came to the ranch this evening, brought a man with him, said he was a county land commissioner and he needed to examine the original deed as part of the challenge process. The deed, Wyatt said. I told him he'd have to wait for you. He said he had legal authority to examine the document and that delaying would be considered obstruction of the commission process. Charlie's eyes moved to Clara briefly, then back to Wyatt. He got in the office, Wyatt. I couldn't stop him without it getting physical, and I didn't know if... Did he take the deed? Clara asked. No, he looked at it. The man with him copied something out of it. Charlie paused. But while they were in there, Pete Aldrich let them in through the back. Silence. Pete's gone, Charlie said. Left an hour ago. Took his kit and his horse. Wyatt's hands were very still on the reins. So Voss has whatever he copied from the deed, Clara said slowly, and he knows we went to Helena and he'll assume we found the survey. She was working through it as she spoke. So what does he do next if he can't make the deed disappear and he knows we have documentation that fills the gap? What's his move? He discredits the survey, Wyatt said. How? Marsh is 73 years old and lives alone. Voss has money and connections and 3 weeks until the commission hearing. Wyatt's voice was controlled, but something had tightened in it. He goes after Marsh, challenges his competency, his records, his recollection, finds someone to testify that the old man's memory isn't reliable. And then even if we present the documents, there's a question mark over them that he can keep arguing indefinitely. Clara's mind moved quickly through this. Can he do that in 3 weeks? He doesn't need to win in 3 weeks. He just needs to create enough doubt that the commission, 2 of whose 3 members are in his pocket, rules against us pending further investigation, which could take years, which effectively gives him what he wants, without him ever having to formally win. Clara sat with that for a moment. The snow had stopped. The air was cold and clear, and the stars were coming out over the Montana plain, and she sat in the wagon on the dark road with the satchel in her lap, and thought about Richard Voss, and how he operated, and what he was actually afraid of. And then she understood something. He's afraid of the Territorial Land Office, she said. Wyatt looked at her. Everything he's doing is at the county level, she said. The Land Commission, the local records, the witnesses he can pressure, and the commissioners he already has. He's built his whole approach at the county level because that's where he has influence. But the filing receipt Marsh gave us references the Territorial Land Office directly. If we file this documentation at the territorial level, not the county commission, but directly with the Territorial Land Office in Helena, then Voss's commission challenge becomes irrelevant. It's superseded. Wyatt stared at her. Can you do that? I filed correspondence with the Ohio Territorial Land Authority twice for the farm before my father died. The process isn't identical, but the structure is similar. She was already reaching into the satchel for the documents. And Marsh's notarized statement is the key. It authenticates the filing receipt, which references the original 1871 deed, which means the chain of title is documented at a level that a county commission cannot overturn. If you're wrong about this, I'm not wrong about this. She found the filing receipt and held it up in the dark, reading it again by the thin starlight. I need to be back in Helena by Monday. I need to get this filed before Voss can organize any counteraction at the territorial level, which will take him longer because he doesn't have his people there the way he has them here. You just came back from Helena. I know, Clara. His voice had changed. Something in it was working against the practical surface pressing up under it. You have been on the road for 2 days. You have been working non-stop since you got to this ranch. You do not owe this operation. I know what I owe and don't owe, she said. That's not what this is. He was quiet. What is it? He asked, and the question was careful, like he was handling something he didn't want to break. Clara looked at him in the dark and said the true thing because she was done being careful about it. It's mine, she said. Not on paper. I know that. But I built part of it. The accounts, the billings contract, the supply renegotiation. I put my hands into it, and I made it better, and now someone is trying to take it, and I am not built for standing aside and watching that happen. She paused. Are you going to tell me I should? The road was dark and quiet around them. No, Wyatt said. Then let's figure out how to get me back to Helena by Monday. Charlie, who had been listening to all of this from horseback, with the expressionless patience of a man who has worked long enough to understand that some conversations need to finish on their own, said quietly, There's a stage out of Red Hollow Monday morning, 6 a.m. I'll be on it, Clara said. She turned back to the satchel and began organizing the documents for the filing, working by feel and memory in the dark, because the stars were not quite enough to read by, and the wagon rolled on toward Red Hollow, and Wyatt drove without speaking, and Clara worked without speaking, and Charlie rode alongside, and the Montana night held all three of them in its enormous cold quiet. It was Wyatt who broke the silence maybe 20 minutes from town. He said it without looking at her eyes on the road, voice low enough that Charlie couldn't have heard it over the horse's pace. When this is done, he said, when the commission is handled and the filing is in, I want to have a different conversation. Clara's hands stilled on the papers. About what? She asked, though she knew. About the fact that you said this ranch is yours, he said. Not on paper. I heard that part. But I'd like to discuss the on-paper part. The air around them was absolutely still. Wyatt, she said carefully. I'm not asking you anything right now, he said. I'm telling you that I intend to ask you something. When this is finished, when you have the space to hear it without a land commission hanging over both our heads. Clara looked at the side of his face in the dark. She had come to Red Hollow, Montana as a rejected woman with a label that wasn't her name. She had come with $43 and 2 suitcases and a letter from a man who didn't show up. And now she was sitting on a wagon in the Montana dark with survey documents in her lap and a man telling her in the most careful and honest way she had ever been told anything that he wanted her to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because he wanted her to stay. All right, she said. She went back to her documents. He kept his eyes on the road. And neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was the most complete and settled thing Clara Bennett had felt in as long as she could remember. But Monday was coming, and Richard Voss was not finished, and the hardest part of all of it was still ahead. The Monday stage left Red Hollow at 6 in the morning, and Clara was at the stop at 5:45, with the satchel over her shoulder and 4 days' worth of carefully organized documentation inside it. She had been up since 3. She had gone through every page twice, cross-referencing the filing receipt against the corrected survey against the notarized statement from Caleb Marsh, making sure the chain of evidence was airtight before she put it in front of a territorial land officer who had no reason to make her life easy. Wyatt was at the stop when she got there. She hadn't expected him. He hadn't said he would come, and she had told herself that was fine, that she was capable of getting on a stage alone and going to Helena alone, because she had been doing things alone since she was 19 years old, and that was not going to change now. He was standing with his hat in his hand, and he had his good coat on, which was the one he wore when he went into town for serious business, not the working coat with the worn left elbow she had quietly mended 2 weeks ago without mentioning it. You don't have to do this, she said. I know, he said. The ranch needs... Charlie can run the ranch for 4 days, he said. Clara. He looked at her steadily. I'm not letting you walk into the territorial land office alone. I'm not afraid of walking in alone. I know you're not, he said. I'm coming anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Then she adjusted the satchel on her shoulder and said, The stage is going to be cold and the road is going to be rough. Yes, he agreed. All right, she said. They got on the stage. There were two other passengers, a traveling merchant named Goss, who fell asleep before they cleared town, and a thin woman in her 50s named Mrs. Delaney, who was going to Helena to visit her daughter, and who looked at Clara and Wyatt with the particular alert curiosity of someone who has been alone with her own thoughts long enough to find other people's situations genuinely interesting. Mrs. Delaney spent about 20 minutes coming to her conclusion, and then she said, "You two married?" Wyatt said, "Not yet." Clara looked at him sharply. He was looking out the window with a perfectly composed expression, as if he had said something unremarkable about the weather. Mrs. Delaney smiled. "Well," she said warmly, "that's honest." Clara returned her gaze to the documents in her lap and said nothing, and did not look at Wyatt again for approximately 15 minutes. And when she finally did, he was still looking out the window with the same composed expression, and she thought that she had never in her life met a man so able to put something enormous into a conversation, and then simply sit with it as if it weighed nothing. Not yet. She held those two words in the back of her mind for the entirety of the stage ride and refused to turn them over because there was work to do first. The Territorial Land Office in Helena occupied the second floor of a government building on Main Street, and the clerk who greeted them when they came through the door was a thin young man with wire spectacles and the harried look of someone who processed more paper than a single human being could reasonably be expected to handle. Clara put the satchel on the counter. "I need to file documentation in a contested land deed matter," she said. "Sweetgrass Creek parcel, Red Hollow Chouteau, County Original Deed. March 1871. There is a corrected survey from 1873 that was filed with this office, but may not be currently associated with the deed record. I have authenticating documentation and a notarized statement from the surveyor." The clerk blinked. "You'd need to speak with Officer Tennant." "Then please get Officer Tennant." He got Officer Tennant. Tennant was a broad man in his 40s with a neat mustache and the unhurried manner of a government official who had learned that being hurried by civilians never made things go faster. He looked at Clara over his spectacles with professional neutrality. "You're filing on behalf of," he began. "Wyatt Mercer Ranch Red Hollow." Clara opened the satchel. "There is a County Land Commission challenge pending against the creek access deed filed by Richard Voss of the same county. I am here to establish that the challenge has no merit, because the corrected survey and filing receipt have existed in the official record since 1873 and simply were not cross-referenced in the current deed documentation." She laid the documents on the counter in the order she had organized them at 3 in the morning. Corrected survey first, filing receipt second. Marsh's notarized statement third. Copy of the original deed with the marginal notation fourth. Tennant looked at them. He picked up the filing receipt first. She had anticipated that it was the most official-looking piece and read it and then looked at the survey and then looked back at the receipt. "This is the original filing receipt?" he asked. "That is the surveyor's retained copy. The office copy should be in your records under this filing number." She pointed to the number on the receipt. "If you locate that file, you'll find the original filing receipt, a copy of the corrected survey, and the notification letter sent to Thomas Mercer at the Red Hollow address." Tennant looked at her carefully. "You've worked with land records before. My father's farm in Ohio, and I've been managing the Mercer Ranch accounts for the past month, which required me to understand the deed structure thoroughly." He studied her for another moment. Then he said to the young clerk, "Pull the 1873 files for Chouteau County Sweetgrass Creek, all of them." The clerk went to the back. Wyatt, who had been standing slightly behind Clara and to her left and had said nothing, since they entered the building, said quietly to her, "You organized those documents in exactly the right order." "I know," she said equally quietly. "Most people lead with the survey. You led with the receipt, because the receipt is what the county commission doesn't have. They know about the survey, or they will, but the filing receipt proves the territorial office was formally notified in 1873, which makes the county challenge procedurally subordinate. That's the document Tennant needed to see first, so he'd look at everything else through that lens." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. You thought all of that through at 3 in the morning. I think better when it's quiet. He said low enough that only she could hear it. I don't know how you know how to do the things you know how to do. Practice, she said, and necessity, and refusing to believe that not knowing something is the same as not being able to learn it. The clerk came back from the records room. He was carrying a folder. He put it on the counter and stepped back, and Tennant opened it, and inside was a document that had been filed in March 1873, and apparently had not been looked at by anyone since, and it was the original filing receipt for the corrected Sweetgrass Creek survey, and it matched Marsh's copy exactly down to the notation in the upper right corner. Tennant looked at it. Then he looked at Clara. This record exists, he said. Yes, she said. The County Commission challenge is based on the assumption that the 1871 deed transfer is defective due to the absence of a corrected survey. Correct. But the corrected survey was filed with this office in 1873, which means the transfer is documented at the territorial level, and the County Commission's review authority in this matter is limited, Clara said. Significantly limited. The Commission can still hold its hearing, but they cannot rule against a deed that has territorial-level documentation. Any adverse ruling they issue would be superseded by this office's records. Tennant put the folder down. He looked at Wyatt, perhaps out of habit, perhaps to confirm that the man in the room agreed with what the woman had just said. Wyatt said, "She's right." Tennant looked back at Clara. Something in his expression had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of respect that was more valuable to her than warmth, because it was professional and she had earned it. I'll need to file a cross-reference notation on the original 1871 deed record, he said, and I'll prepare a certification letter documenting the existence of the 1873 filing for use in the commission hearing. He paused. That will take until tomorrow morning. We'll wait, Clara said. They found a boarding house 2 streets over and took 2 rooms, and Clara sat in hers at the small desk and wrote out everything she intended to say at the commission hearing, because she was not going to walk into that room unprepared, regardless of what documentation she was carrying. She wrote for 3 hours, and then she read it back, and then she revised it, and then she was satisfied, and she allowed herself to stop. There was a knock at the door. She opened it. Wyatt was standing in the hallway with a plate from the boarding house kitchen and 2 cups of something hot. You haven't eaten since this morning, he said. She stepped back and let him in, and he put the plate and cups on the desk and looked at the pages spread across it and said nothing about them, which she appreciated because she was not in the mood to explain her preparation process. They ate without talking much. The food was simple and good, and the silence was the comfortable kind. Then he said, I need to tell you something about why I've been alone this long. She looked up. He was looking at the cup in his hands. Margaret Hollis and what I told you before was true. Her family didn't approve she made her choice, but that wasn't all of it. He paused. Before Margaret, there was a business partner, a man named Darnell. I trusted him with everything, the finances, the contacts, the plan for the ranch's first expansion. He was supposed to bring investment capital from the east. Instead, he brought debt and left before any of it was due. Clara was very still. I spent 4 years paying off what he left, Wyatt said. Not because I was legally required to. Because the people he borrowed from in the county trusted the Mercer name to stand behind it, and I wasn't willing to let them lose money because of my poor judgment. He looked up. After that, I made a decision. I would work with people at arm's length. I would treat people fairly and maintain my distance and never again give someone the kind of access that allowed them to damage what I built. And then Pete Aldrich walked into your barn, Clara said quietly. And then Pete Aldrich. His jaw moved. But what I'm trying to say, what I want you to understand, is that it wasn't distance for its own sake. It was protection. It felt like the same thing as keeping the ranch safe. But it wasn't, Clara said. No, he said. It wasn't. He looked at her directly. And then you got off a train in Red Hollow and started reorganizing my accounts and arguing with supply merchants and going to Billings and Helena, and I couldn't maintain the distance because you weren't operating at the distance. You were already inside it. Clara set her cup down carefully. I wasn't doing it deliberately, she said. I know, he said. That's part of what I'm saying. The room was very quiet. Wyatt, she said, when we get back when this is finished. I said I'd wait until it was finished, he said. I'll wait. I wanted you to know the shape of the thing. Before the hearing. Before whatever Voss does next. He met her eyes. I didn't want you to not know. Clara looked at him in the boarding house room in Helena, Montana, and thought that she had come across the country in search of a second chance, and had found instead something she hadn't known enough to look for a man who told you the difficult things, because he thought you deserved to know them, who defended you in public without being asked and told you why in private without being prompted, who watched you reorganize his accounts and negotiate his contracts, and then said plainly that you had changed what his life looked like. She had been trying not to love him. She recognized now that she had already failed at that sometime between the Billings station and the Helena Road, and that the failure was not a loss. I know, she said. The shape of it. He nodded once. Get some sleep, he said, and stood and picked up his cup. You too, she said. He left, and Clara sat at the desk with her hearing notes spread out in front of her, and her heart doing something she didn't try to quiet anymore, and she thought about the commission hearing, and about Richard Voss, and about what came next, because the certification letter was one piece, and the hearing was still ahead, and she had learned enough about how men like Voss operated to know he would not simply fold, because the legal ground had shifted under him. He would come at them a different way. She was right about that. The certification letter from the Territorial Land Office was ready at 9 the next morning, signed by Tennant himself, and bearing the territorial seal. Clara read it standing at the counter before she put it in the satchel, and it was exactly what she needed. Clear official referencing the 1873 filing by number and date, confirming the completeness of the Mercer deed chain at the territorial level. They were back in Red Hollow by Wednesday evening. Charlie met them at the ranch with the expression Clara had come to understand meant there was news, and it was not good news. Voss called the commission hearing forward, he said. It's not next month anymore. It's Friday. Clara stared at him. This Friday. He filed an emergency motion yesterday, said the continued uncertainty over the water rights is causing financial harm to county agricultural interests. Charlie looked at Wyatt. He has the authority to do it. 2 of the 3 commissioners approved the motion. Friday? Clara said again, thinking. That gives us 2 days. Is 2 days enough? Wyatt asked. She thought about the certification letter in her satchel. She thought about the organized documentation, the notarized statement, the filing receipt. She thought about what she had written in the Helena boarding house room, and had planned to refine before a hearing that was supposed to be 3 weeks away. Yes, she said. It's enough. She spent Thursday preparing with the same disciplined focus she brought to everything. She drafted the formal response to the commission challenge, organized the documents in the order she would present them, and wrote the precise legal argument she would make. Not the argument of a lawyer, because she was not a lawyer, but the argument of a woman who had spent her adult life working with contracts and records and the practical logic of how documented transactions were structured and what they meant. Late Thursday afternoon there was a knock at the ranch door. It was not anyone she expected. It was Margaret Hollis. She stood at the door in her good coat with her hands folded and her chin raised, and the look of a woman who has decided to have a difficult conversation and is not going to be dissuaded from it. Clara opened the door and waited. I want to speak with you, Margaret said. Not with Wyatt. With you. Clara stepped back. Come in. Margaret came into the entry and looked around briefly, and Clara could see her taking in the changes, the neatness, the organization, the particular evidence of a woman's hand in a space that had previously been managed only by practicality. Something moved through Margaret's face that might have been regret, if regret could be as composed as everything else about her. I know about the commission hearing tomorrow, Margaret said. Then you know we're prepared for it. I know you have documentation. She paused. I also know that Voss has arranged for someone to testify that the Mercer deed was obtained through improper influence on the original territorial surveyor. Someone who claims to have been present at the 1871 survey. Clara kept her face completely still. Who? A man named Cutter. He arrived in Red Hollow on Tuesday. Voss brought him from somewhere in Wyoming. Margaret looked at her directly. He's going to say that Thomas Mercer paid the original surveyor to record the creek access incorrectly, that the creek access wasn't legitimately part of the original parcel, and the 1871 deed was falsified. The silence stretched. Why are you telling me this? Clara said. Margaret held her gaze. Because Wyatt Mercer is a decent man, and he doesn't deserve what Voss is doing to him. A pause. And because I have been doing things I'm not proud of for reasons that seemed practical at the time, and I'm tired of it. Clara studied her. You were working with Voss. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. He suggested that if Wyatt were sufficiently pressured socially through his reputation, through questions about his relationship with you, he might be more inclined to settle. I allowed myself to believe that wasn't the same as being part of the scheme. She stopped. I was wrong. Clara felt the weight of that admission not warmly, because Margaret Hollis had done real damage with her campaign against her, but honestly, it took something to come to a rival's door and say I was wrong. The man Cutter, Clara said. Do you know anything else about him? Where he's from? How Voss found him? What he's being paid? He's staying at the Red Hollow Hotel. Voss is paying his expenses and a fee. Margaret hesitated. He's been talking at the bar. A man like that always talks. Clara was already thanking. Thank you, she said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected, she said, when I first heard about you. People rarely are, Clara said. Margaret left and Clara stood in the entry for exactly 30 seconds, and then she went and found Charlie Foss. I need you to go to the Red Hollow Hotel tonight, she said. There's a man named Cutter staying there. I need to know everything he says to anyone. Charlie looked at her. Tonight? Tonight? Charlie went. She told Wyatt about Margaret's visit at dinner. She told him everything without softening it, the admission about working with Voss, the testimony Cutter was being paid to give what it was designed to do. Wyatt's face went through something she watched carefully, anger, and beneath the anger something older and more tired, the look of a man who had been fighting versions of this same thing for a long time and understood what it meant that Voss had decided to attack his father's name. He's saying my father falsified the deed, Wyatt said. He's going to try to say it, Clara said. He won't get to finish. How are you going to stop him? I don't know yet, she said. I'm waiting to hear from Charlie. Charlie came back at 10 o'clock. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, Cutter's a land claims agent out of Cheyenne. Lost his license 3 years ago. Disciplinary action, he provided false testimony in a deed contest. He paused. He told 2 different men at the bar tonight that he's done this kind of work 4 times and never been caught because the other side never knows to look. Clara looked at Charlie. Charlie looked at Clara. There'll be a record, she said. There'll be a record, he agreed, in Cheyenne. Wyoming Territory Land Commission, Charlie said. She stood up. How fast can a telegram get a response from Cheyenne? Overnight if the office is staffed. Is the telegraph office still open? For another hour. She was already picking up her coat. Wyatt stood. I'll come. Stay here, she said. I need you rested for tomorrow because you're going to have to hold yourself together in that hearing room regardless of what Voss does. And if I'm worried about you instead of the argument, I'll be less effective. She looked at him firmly. Trust me. He sat down. She went to the telegraph office, and she sent 2 telegrams, one to the Wyoming Territory Land Commission Records Office in Cheyenne, requesting the Cutter disciplinary record by urgent return, and one to Caleb Marsh in Helena, warning him that his credibility might be attacked at the hearing and asking him to be available by telegram for confirming questions. She was back at the ranch by 11. She slept 4 hours. The County Land Commission hearing was held in the Red Hollow Courthouse at 10 in the morning, and it was standing room only by 9:30, because in a town this small, a land dispute involving Richard Voss and the Mercer Ranch was the most significant event of the season, and everyone knew it. Clara came in with Wyatt beside her and the satchel on her shoulder, and she walked to the respondent's table and laid the documents out in the order she had prepared them. And she was aware of the room watching her, and she did not acknowledge the room watching her because the room was not relevant to the argument she was about to make. Richard Voss was already seated at the claimant's table. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with the confident ease of someone who has won many rooms and expected to win this one. He glanced at Clara, once a brief assessing look, and then looked away, which told her he had not updated his understanding of what she was capable of. That was useful. The three commissioners were at the bench. Aldrich on the left, Porter in the center, and Voss's own seat at the right was occupied today by a man named Harris, who had been appointed temporarily for this hearing since Voss was the filing party. Harris looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows which side his obligations run and doesn't entirely like knowing it. The commission chairman Porter called the hearing to order. Voss presented his case first. He did it smoothly with the confidence of a man who had done this before. He laid out the gap in the deed documentation, the absence of the corrected survey from the current deed record, the question about whether the creek access had ever been properly transferred. His attorney, he had brought an attorney from Billings, spoke for 20 minutes with the precision of someone who had been well paid to find every weakness in the Mercer position. Then Cutter took the stand. He was a compact man in his 40s, with a steady voice and the particular practiced quality of someone who has given testimony before. Not nervous, not overly smooth calibrated. He stated that he had been present at the 1871 survey as an assistant to the federal surveyor, and that he had witnessed Thomas Mercer make a financial arrangement with the surveyor to include the creek access in the parcel boundary, despite the survey data not supporting it. The room stirred. Wyatt's hand on the table was absolutely still. Clara waited until Cutter finished. Then she stood up. She addressed the commission chairman directly. "Mr. Porter, before the commission takes Mr. Cutter's testimony into consideration, I need to enter documentation into the record and request that the commission address a threshold question about this witness's credibility." Porter looked at her. "You're not an attorney, Miss Bennett. I'm the authorized representative of the respondent, which the commission rules permit." She had confirmed this the previous evening. "I am prepared to demonstrate that the claimant's witness has a documented history of providing false testimony in land commission proceedings, and that accepting his testimony without examining that record would constitute a failure of the commission's duty to establish factual accuracy." The room went very quiet. Voss looked at her for the first time with something other than dismissal. "What documentation?" Porter said. She put the Wyoming Territory Land Commission disciplinary record on the bench. The telegram response from Cheyenne had arrived at 6 in the morning. She had been at the telegraph office when it opened, and the records were exactly what she needed. Robert Cutter, licensed land claims agent, Wyoming Territory license, revoked June 1879, following a disciplinary finding that he provided false testimony in the Laramie County deed contest of that year. The finding notes specifically that Mr. Cutter represented himself as a witness to a survey he had not attended. She looked at Cutter steadily. "I'd like to ask Mr. Cutter under oath whether he disclosed his Wyoming disciplinary record to the party that engaged him for this hearing." Cutter's composure had cracked slightly. Not collapsed, he was experienced enough to hold most of it, but the edges had moved. "I'll ask that question," Porter said. He looked at Cutter. "Mr. Cutter, were you present at the 1871 federal survey of the Sweetgrass Creek parcel in Chouteau County?" Cutter hesitated. That hesitation lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt much longer. "I was in the area," he said carefully. "That's not what you testified," Clara said clearly. "You testified you were present. Were you present at the survey itself or not?" Porter gave her a look. "Miss Bennett, I apologize, Mr. Porter. I withdraw the interjection, but I'd ask the commission to note the change in Mr. Cutter's characterization of his presence." The room was very still. Voss's attorney put his hand on Voss's arm and said something quiet. Voss's jaw was tight. Clara moved on before anyone could regroup. She presented the Territorial Land Office certification letter. She presented the corrected survey. She presented the filing receipt and Marsh's notarized statement. She walked the commission through the chain of documentation with the same methodical clarity she used on the ranch accounts, not performing, not arguing, simply presenting what existed and letting its coherence make the case for her. When she was finished, she said, "The creek access transfer is documented at the territorial level. The county commission has no authority to invalidate a deed chain that is confirmed by the Territorial Land Office. Mr. Voss's challenge has no procedural basis, and his witness's testimony, even if credible, which this commission now has reason to question, cannot overturn a documented territorial record." She sat down. Porter looked at the documents for a long time. Harris was staring at the table. Aldrich was staring at Voss. Voss stood up. "Mr. Porter, I'd like to request a recess to review the new documentation." "No," Porter said. One word. Flat. Voss sat back down. Porter spoke with Harris quietly for 3 minutes. Then he spoke with Aldrich for 2. Then he picked up the certification letter and read it one more time. He set it down. "The Commission finds the documentation presented by the respondent sufficient to establish the validity of the Mercer Creek access deed at the territorial level," he said. "The claimant's challenge is dismissed. The Commission so rules." He struck the bench once. The room erupted. Clara sat completely still. She heard the noise around her, the voices, the movement. Charlie Foss saying something emphatic somewhere behind her, and she sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed, and let herself feel it, all of it. The weeks of work and worry and travel, and the 3 a.m. document sessions, and the cold wagon rides, and the telegram at 6 a.m. She let all of it arrive at once and settle into the fact that it was finished and the ranch was safe. Wyatt put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and that was enough. Voss left without speaking. His attorney followed him. Cutter was already gone. Margaret Hollis, who had been standing in the back of the room, caught Clara's eye as people began filing out and gave a single nod that Clara returned, and that was the end of that. Outside the courthouse, Charlie was shaking hands with people Clara didn't know, radiating a satisfaction that his face almost managed to contain. The ranch hands who had come into town to hear the ruling were talking loudly and with great feeling. Someone was already suggesting that this called for a drink, which it probably did. Wyatt and Clara stood slightly apart from all of it. "You walked in there and took his case apart in front of the whole county," he said. "The documentation did that," she said. "I just organized it." "Clara." She looked at him. "You did that," he said. "Not the documents. You." She held his gaze. "I think," he said carefully, "that I have been waiting since the day you got off that train to say something I am going to say now." He stopped, steadied himself the way she had come to recognize the particular gathering of a man who does not speak carelessly and is making sure he doesn't now. "I would like you to stay, not as the woman who manages the accounts, not as the person who lives in the cabin. I would like you to stay as my wife if you're willing, because this ranch is yours in every way that matters already, and I would like it to be yours in the way that's left." The street noise went on around them. Someone laughed. A horse stamped. Clara Bennett had come to Red Hollow, Montana 6 weeks ago with $43 and a letter from a man who didn't show up. She looked at Wyatt Mercer, the man who had said enough on a train platform and meant it, who had told her the difficult things, because he thought she deserved to know them, who had sat in a hearing room while she dismantled a land fraud and then put his hand over hers without saying a word, because that was exactly the right thing to do. "Yes," she said. He didn't whoop. He didn't sweep her up in a grand gesture. He was not that kind of man, and she did not want that kind of man. He simply took her hand properly this time in the middle of the Red Hollow street, with the whole town watching, and held it. And she held back, and it was the most complete thing she had felt in as long as she could remember. Charlie Foss, who had turned around in time to witness this, looked at the sky for a moment with the expression of a man exercising enormous restraint, and then said to no one in particular, "About time." Charlie Foss's assessment about time turned out to be the majority opinion in Red Hollow, though not everyone arrived at it immediately. The news that Wyatt Mercer had proposed to Clara Bennett on the courthouse steps approximately 40 minutes after she dismantled Richard Voss's land fraud in front of the entire county spread through town with the particular velocity that only the most satisfying stories achieve. By sundown, it had reached every household. By the following morning, it had acquired details that neither Wyatt nor Clara had supplied, including, according to Mrs. Hale's version, a speech that Wyatt had apparently delivered which bore no resemblance to anything he had actually said, since Wyatt Mercer did not make speeches, and the people who knew him understood that 2 honest sentences from him carried more weight than 200 words from anyone else. Doris Crane. The woman with the feathered hat, who had set another mail-order bride on the platform 6 weeks ago, told her neighbor that she had always thought Clara Bennett seemed like a capable woman, and that she had said so from the beginning. Her neighbor, who had been standing next to her on the platform that day, did not contradict her because life in a small town requires a certain amount of diplomatic amnesia. Clara heard all of this and found it neither surprising nor particularly important. What mattered was the work still in front of them, and there was considerable work. The Billings contract needed its final documentation. The spring cattle plan needed to be revised upward now that the creek access was secured and the water rights were clean. The cabin she had been living in needed to be properly winterized for the hands who would use it going forward, because Clara was moving into the main house, and that transition required the kind of practical organization she did automatically and efficiently and without drama. She was 3 days into the supply reorganization when she found the second set of books. She had been going through a storage chest in the back of the office, one she hadn't touched before because it had been locked, and she hadn't wanted to push at things that weren't immediately necessary, and Wyatt had given her the key without ceremony when she asked for it. She unlocked it, expecting old correspondence or redundant records, and what she found instead was a ledger she didn't recognize, written in a hand that was neither Wyatt's nor the former foreman's. She opened it. It was financial records. But they weren't the ranch accounts. They were something else, a separate set of entries tracking money that had moved in and out of a different account entirely with dates going back 4 years, and notations she didn't immediately understand. She read the first 3 pages carefully, and then she sat back, and then she read them again. She went to find Wyatt. He was in the barn working with Hank Morse on the fence repair materials, and he looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. "What is it?" he said. She held up the ledger. "What is this?" He looked at it, and something moved through his face recognition, and something more complicated than she could read quickly. "Come inside," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, and she put the ledger between them. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When Darnell left the business partner I told you about, he didn't just leave debt. He left accounts that I didn't know existed. Money borrowed against the ranch's name from men who weren't banks, who didn't have bank patience or bank processes." He paused. "I paid back everyone I knew about, but there was one man, a man named Carver, out of Fort Benton, who contacted me 2 years after Darnell left and said there was money owed to him that Darnell had borrowed using my signature." Clara went very still. "Using your signature?" "He had documents. Papers with my name on them that I had never signed." Wyatt's hands were flat on the table. "I didn't know if they were forgeries or if Darnell had somehow gotten access to signed documents and repurposed them. I still don't know. But Carver had a lawyer, and I had already spent 4 years paying off Darnell's legitimate debts, and I was tired, and the amount wasn't enough to destroy the ranch, but it was enough to matter, and I made an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "I agreed to pay him back over 4 years. In irregular amounts, so it didn't show in the main accounts." He nodded at the ledger. "That's what that is." Clara opened the ledger again and looked at the dates and the amounts. "How much is still outstanding?" he told her. It was significant. Not catastrophic, not something that would threaten the ranch given the Billings contract and the new revenue projections. But it was real, and it had been sitting in a locked chest, and she had not known about it, and they were engaged to be married, and she needed to know what she was thinking before she said anything. She was thinking several things simultaneously. She was thinking about the pattern of it, a man who had been betrayed by someone he trusted completely, who had then spent years quietly paying the consequences without telling anyone, who had built a habit of carrying things alone, because carrying them alone was the only way he had learned to make sure no one else got hurt. She was thinking about whether she was angry. She was thinking about whether she had the right to be angry. She decided she had some right to it, and that it was not the most important thing in the room. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because when you arrived, you were a stranger. And then by the time you weren't a stranger..." He stopped. "I should have told you before I asked you to marry me. I know that." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He held her gaze and didn't try to argue it. "Is there anything else?" she said. "Anything in any other locked chest or bank account or arrangement I haven't been told about?" "No," he said. "Nothing else." She believed him. She believed him not because she was naive, but because she had spent 6 weeks reading this man, reading the way he spoke and the way he didn't speak, and the gap between what he said and what he meant, and she had become accurate at it, and what she read now was a man who had just handed her the last thing he'd been holding back. "All right," she said. "All right," he said carefully. "It changes the spring financial picture by about this much." She moved her hand slightly. "I'll rework the projections. We can structure the remaining payments differently now that the billings contract is in. We can pay Carver off fully by fall rather than dragging it into next year, which will cost us slightly in the short term, but cleans the books completely." She looked at him. "And Wyatt, we don't have locked chests, not anymore. I need to know everything if I'm going to manage this operation properly, and I am going to manage it properly, and that means everything is on the table." He exhaled slowly. "Yes." "Say it plainly," she said. "Not just yes." "No more locked chests," he said. She closed the ledger and set it aside. "Good. Now let me have the spring projections back." He stared at her for a moment. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "Did you expect something else?" "I expected more." "I'm angry," she said honestly. "I'll probably be angry about it for a few days, but I'm not going to make that more important than the fact that you told me, and the fact that it's fixable, and the fact that you've been carrying it alone for 4 years because that's what you do when you've been badly hurt and haven't had anyone to carry things with." She met his eyes. "You have someone now. Don't do it again." He looked at her for a long moment. "I won't," he said. She picked up the projections. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in November, 6 weeks away, which gave Clara enough time to finish the fall accounts, finalize the billings paperwork, renegotiate 2 more supply contracts, and write a 12-page letter to her sister in Columbus, explaining everything that had happened since Ohio, which was the longest letter she had ever written, and which she was fairly certain her sister would read 3 times before she believed it. She also, in the 2nd week of November, received a letter from Nathan Cole. She almost didn't open it. She held it for a full 30 seconds and considered that not opening it was also a valid choice, and then she opened it because she did not believe in leaving things unread that could be read. Nathan Cole wrote to congratulate her on her engagement, which he had apparently heard about through the county grapevine. He expressed genuine-sounding good wishes. He said that he understood now that sending Jim Holt to the station instead of coming himself had been a cowardice he regretted. He said he hoped she was well. He did not ask anything of her. He did not try to renegotiate anything or suggest any ongoing connection. It was in the final assessment a decent letter from a man who had behaved badly and knew it and was trying to say so without making a production of it. Clara wrote back 4 lines. She thanked him for his good wishes. She wished him well in return. She told him that no apology was necessary because the outcome had suited her considerably better than the original plan. She signed it with her name and left it at that. She showed it to Wyatt before she sent it. He read it and said, "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "The outcome did suit me considerably better." He looked at her with that almost smile that she had spent 6 weeks learning and could now read completely. "Yes," he said, "it did." She sent the letter. 3 days before the wedding, Richard Voss came to the ranch. He came alone, which was itself significant. No attorney, no commissioner, no hired witness. He came in the late afternoon and asked to speak with Wyatt, and Clara, who was in the office when Charlie came to tell her, said to send him in, and then went herself to find Wyatt, because she intended to be present for whatever this was. Voss sat across the desk from both of them, and he looked older than he had in the commission hearing room, which might have been the light, or might have been something else. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. "All right," Wyatt said. "The challenge failed, and I'm not going to file another one. I wanted you to hear that directly." He paused. "I have been operating in this county for 20 years by finding weak points and using them. It has worked." He looked at Clara briefly. "It didn't work this time because the weak point I thought I saw wasn't actually there." "The weak point you thought you saw," Clara said evenly, "was me." He met her gaze. "Yes. And you were wrong about that. I was wrong about that." He said it without apparent difficulty, which surprised her slightly. She had expected more defensiveness. "I want to discuss a different arrangement. A legitimate one. I want to discuss buying the water rights, not the parcel, just the water rights at a fair price. A price set by independent assessment, not by me." Wyatt looked at him steadily. "Why would I sell anything to you? Because the fair price for those water rights, if you don't need to sell under pressure, is substantially higher than what I offered before. And because I am in a position where I need those water rights to maximize the value of the land I already own, and you are in a position where a significant cash payment would close out any remaining obligations on this ranch completely." He looked at Clara again. "She knows the number I'm talking about." Clara looked at Voss. She did know the number. She had been thinking about it since she reworked the projections after finding the second ledger. The water rights sold properly, with an independent assessment, would clear every remaining debt and leave them with operating capital that would change what the next 5 years looked like for the ranch. It did not mean she trusted Richard Voss. It did not mean this was uncomplicated. "We'd need independent legal representation for the transaction," she said. "A lawyer not from this county." "Agreed," Voss said. "The assessment would be conducted by a party approved by both sides." "Agreed. And the sale covers water rights only, not access rights, not any interest in the parcel itself. The Mercer Ranch retains full title to the land and all associated rights except the specific water extraction agreement we negotiate." "Agreed," Voss said. She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was quiet for the moment. She watched him think. Watched him weigh what his father had built, and what the creek meant, and what 30 years of fighting with insufficient resources looked like against what they could do with clean books and real capital, and the freedom to build forward instead of just defend. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Voss said. He stood and left, and Wyatt and Clara sat in the office after he was gone, and neither of them spoke for a while. "He came because you beat him," Wyatt said finally. "He doesn't respect people who lose to him. He never has to. But someone who wins, he understands how to deal with that." "He came because it's good business," Clara said, "which means the number is real." "Is it a good deal?" She thought about it honestly. "If the independent assessment comes back where I think it will, yes. It's a good deal. It doesn't give him anything he can use against you, and it gives us the ability to do things with this ranch that we can't currently do." She looked at him. "But it has to be on our terms. Every line of that agreement goes through me before you sign it." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and thought about how much had shifted in 6 weeks, not just the external things, the accounts and the contracts and the commission hearing, but the internal architecture of what they were to each other. She had come to this ranch as a stranger and become its backbone, and he had started as the man who offered her a cabin and become the person she was most honest with on earth. "All right," she said. "Let's get married first, then we'll deal with Voss." He almost smiled. "Practical to the last." "It's what you love about me," she said, and then heard what she'd said and looked back at her papers. He said quietly, "Among other things." The wedding took place on a Saturday in late November in the small church at the edge of Red Hollow that smelled of pine and candle wax and the particular stillness of a building that holds important moments for a community and knows it. There were perhaps 40 people. Charlie Foss, who cleaned up with a thoroughness that astonished everyone who knew him. The ranch hands, all of them in their good clothes. Mrs. Delaney from the stage to Helena, who had apparently followed the story and driven 40 miles to see the ending. Caleb Marsh, who had traveled from Helena when Clara's letter reached him, and who shook Wyatt's hand before the ceremony with the grip of a man honoring a debt owed to someone's father. The Billings buyers. Harrison and Boyle, who happened to be passing through on their November round, and who accepted the invitation with a warmth that said the professional respect had grown into something else. Margaret Hollis was not there, and that was appropriate, and no one made mention of it. Clara wore her pale blue dress, the same one she had worn on the train from Ohio, pressed and cleaned, and no longer a source of mockery, because nothing had the power to mock her anymore. She had decided that the dress she had worn when she arrived was the dress she would wear when she stayed, because that felt right, in a way she didn't need to explain to anyone. She walked in alone. She had no family present, and she had decided she didn't need anyone to give her away, because she was not a thing being transferred from one set of hands to another. She walked in on her own 2 feet, the way she had been walking since she was 19, and she came down the aisle and stood next to Wyatt Mercer and looked at him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the platform the first day, like she was a person fully and completely with all the weight that entailed. The minister spoke. They made their vows. They were not elaborate vows, neither of them had wanted elaborate, but they were real, and they were said in the particular voice people use, when they mean every word and are aware that they mean every word, and the small church held the weight of them without difficulty. When it was done, Charlie Foss led what could generously be described as a cheer from the assembled ranch hands, which started dignified and became something else within seconds. And Mrs. Delaney cried with the uninhibited sincerity of a woman who has lived long enough to know a good love story when she sees one from beginning to end. And Caleb Marsh stood straight and nodded once, and that was enough. At the reception of the ranch house afterward, with the kind of food that happens when Clara Bennett has been planning it for 3 weeks, Jim Harrison from the Billings Syndicate cornered Wyatt near the window and said, "That woman you married, where did she learn to negotiate?" "Necessity," Wyatt said. "Whatever it was, hold on to her." "I intend to," Wyatt said. Later, after the guests had gone and the ranch house had gone quiet, and the Montana night had settled in around them, with its enormous dark and its cold and its indifferent stars, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her account books because she was who she was, and old habits don't simply stop on significant days. Wyatt came in from checking the barn and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You're working," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. It looked similar. He sat down across from her. The same chair, the same table, the same lamp throwing the same light. But everything was different, and they both knew it. "The Voss negotiation," she said. "I want to start it in January, after the new year accounts are settled." "All right. The spring cattle plan needs another revision once the assessment is done. If the water rights sale goes through at the number I'm expecting, we can expand the North Pasture operation and increase the herd by—" "Clara," he said. She looked up. "It'll keep," he said. She looked at the accounts, then she looked at him, then slowly she closed the book. "You're right," she said. "It'll keep." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and the lamp burned low. And outside, the Montana night did what it always did, went on and on and on without concern for human significance, vast and cold and entirely indifferent. But inside the Mercer ranch house, something had been built that the cold could not reach. In the years that followed, people in Red Hollow and across Choteau County told the story of Clara and Wyatt Mercer the way communities tell the stories that matter to them in pieces through different mouths, with different emphasis depending on who was telling it and why. Some told it as a love story. Some told it as a business story. Some old-timers told it as a frontier story, a story about what the Montana Territory had actually been. Not the romantic version, but the real one, hard and unforgiving and occasionally capable of something remarkable. The Mercer Ranch expanded twice in 5 years. The North Pasture operation grew. The Billings contract became a 10-year agreement that 3 other ranches in the county eventually joined through Clara's negotiation. The Voss water rights transaction went through at a number that made Harrison and Boyle look at each other when they heard it, because it was the number Clara had predicted to the dollar. Richard Voss retired from active land acquisition in 1886. He did not retire graciously, but he retired. The county changed around him the way counties change when a particular kind of power stops being the only power in the room. Clara's sister came from Ohio in the spring of 1884. She came for a visit and stayed because there was work to be done, and Clara was not a woman who wasted good help when it arrived, and because the life she found at the Mercer Ranch was the kind of life that makes a person understand why their sister wrote a 12-page letter trying to explain it. Caleb Marsh came back twice. The second time he was 80 years old, and he sat on the ranch porch in the afternoon and watched Clara work through a contract revision with the efficiency that had not diminished in 12 years. And he said to Wyatt, who was sitting beside him, "Your father would have liked her." "I know," Wyatt said. "Not just because she's capable," Marsh said. "Because she's honest. Your father valued that above everything." "So do I," Wyatt said. Charlie Foss worked the Mercer Ranch for 22 more years. He never married. He said once in the dry, factual way he said everything that he had never found anyone whose company he preferred to the Mercer Ranches, which everyone who knew him understood, was about as sentimental as Charlie Foss got, and which was enough. And Clara. Clara Bennett Mercer, who had arrived in Red Hollow, Montana, with $43 and a letter from a man who didn't show up, who had been called a mail-order bride on a train platform, by a woman who thought labels were the same as truths. Clara built exactly what she had come across the country to build. Not because someone gave it to her. Not because she found the right man and he rescued her from her circumstances, but because she was capable and stubborn and honest, and refused at every point where refusal was available to her to let other people's estimation of her become her own. She was the one who organized the accounts. She was the one who went to Billings and negotiated the rate. She was the one who found the corrected survey and understood what it meant and rode to Helena twice to do something about it. She was the one who sent the telegram to Cheyenne at 6 in the morning and built the argument that ended Voss's claim before it could take root. Wyatt had given her a cabin and a fair wage, and the rare valuable thing of being treated like a person before she had done anything to earn it. He had defended her name when he didn't have to, and told her difficult truths because he thought she deserved them, and asked her to stay in the plainest possible language because plain language was the only kind he trusted. That was love, the real kind, not the kind that arrived complete and perfect, like a thing purchased and delivered, but the kind that was built the same way everything worth having was built, day by day, decision by decision, 2 people choosing in the ordinary moments and the impossible ones to face the same direction. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Wyatt found Clara at the kitchen table with the account books because some things do not change, and he put a cup of coffee at the edge of the desk without being asked, and she picked it up without looking up from the page, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. They had been saying it for 20 years in every other way that mattered. A woman does not become less valuable because someone failed to recognize her worth, and a man does not become more than what he is. By love, he becomes finally and completely exactly who he was always capable of being. That was the truth of it. That was what they built, and it stood.